Hey guys, welcome back to Flying Wombat TV, the channel where it's all about making fun and creative styles of beer with science and biotechnology involved. So today we're probably doing one of our more sciencey, biotech related videos out of all the videos we've done thus far. So all about yeast culturing, yeast harvesting, grabbing these amazing single-celled little organisms and growing them and harvesting them for more and more beer. So today, come along for the ride and we're going to show you how to culture and harvest your own yeast for homebrewing. Okay, so quick run through on the equipment and the stuff you're going to need to do all your yeast harvesting and culturing. So from this side to that side, starting with just a clean cloth, just to hold hot things so you don't burn your hands. A roll of paper towel and 80% ethanol. If you don't have 80% ethanol, you could just use a cheap vodka, from your local liquor shop. But if you do have 80% ethanol, that's better. It's laboratory grade. You can actually sterilize and clean stuff with it. So if you have that, great. Next, you're going to need disposable gloves. There's a scene where I don't use gloves, and I absolutely should have. It is the cleaner, more sterile way to go. So disposable gloves. Next, you're going to need yeast to work with to actually harvest and culture. Then you're going to need a couple of these jars. So these are reagent jars. You don't need to use these ones specifically. You just need glass jars in general. So if you're using mason jars, great. If you're using, old pasta sauce jars, that's totally fine. Just make sure you clean it really well so it's absolutely, spotless inside. And definitely make sure that the jar can seal airtight. So if the lid doesn't work properly, don't use that jar because air is going to get in. It's going to ruin your yeast. You'll need a means to take a gravity measurement, so you could use a refractometer if you have one. If not, use a hydrometer with a measuring cylinder, whatever you got available to you. A big jug or a sink to tip shit out of and measure things. A couple of different Erlenmeyer flask sizes. So again, you don't need to use Erlenmeyer flasks. This is for the actual culturing part, growing the yeast. If you're not going to use an Erlenmeyer flask, make sure whatever jar you are using is actually heat safe, because if you're heating these jars up and cooling them down with different liquids really quickly and it's not heat safe, it's going to shatter. So if you're not using one of these, use something that is heat safe. But honestly, you can pick these up for like 10 to 20 bucks from homebrew shops online. We'll drop a link below on where you can get a couple of these from. Next, a stir plate to actually grow and culture the yeast. If you have one, if you don't, not a big deal. There's a workaround for that. A pair of tongs, because you're going to be grabbing really hot stuff out of a really hot pot. So a pot and a means to heat up that pot. And I think lastly, if I haven't missed anything, foil to seal off your jars. So homebrewing can become a very expensive hobby. So it's nice to be able to cut corners or, salvage product where you can. Yeast is definitely one of those things. You can absolutely harvest yeast from each subsequent batch. So A, it's a cost saving, but B, if you use a particular generation, time after time after time on various batches, it's kind of like natural selection. You are going to start getting qualities and unique properties out of that yeast if you use it with enough repetition that kind of suit your styles of beer or suit your palate if you keep reusing that particular strain. So we're going to harvest this stuff down here. So if you have a look at the bottom of this tank here, you can see there's quite a lot of gunky stuff going on. So when you're doing a bit of yeast harvesting, if you're using a setup like this where you have a dump valve with your tank, the first dump after the first couple of days of fermentation is going to contain a lot of trub. So just a lot of random crap and gunk that is not viable yeast. It's not healthy yeast. You don't want to keep it. You don't want to harvest it. So it's important to do a first initial dump, which we did a little bit earlier. Next dump, this one here, looks like it's going to be pretty healthy yeast. So also for context, this is a black beer. This is a stout that we're dumping here. So that's why it's so dark. Otherwise, that would look like unhealthy yeast if this was a pale ale. Anyway, so we're going to dump this stuff out into our Erlenmeyer flask, and then we're going to do the next step of yeast harvesting and culturing after this. First things first, we want to open this up. We want to make sure that we spray everything to keep it all, pretty sanitary. And then we want to connect on our tri-clamp. So these have already all been sanitized. Yes, I should be wearing gloves while I'm doing this. No, I don't really care because yeast is pretty hardy. It'll probably be fine. It's all right. And also, I couldn't be bothered finding gloves. All right, so we're just gonna attach this just to make it a little bit easier to do our dump. This is a butterfly valve here. So we've explained it in another video. Basically just makes it a lot easier for me to control how much flow rate is coming out of this thing at any one time. Now, we're gonna just open this up here and let all the trub start coming out into our flask. Nice, that looks absolutely disgusting.
Nice day today.
Bit of a weird chit chat.
Yeah. Practice
Alright.
silence.
So there's a little bit there. It's mostly gone. That part's just kind of clinging to the glass wall there, so I'm not too fussed about trying to get that one there. We've got a pretty healthy amount of this stuff. So we want to seal this up so that it's closed off to the atmosphere, and then we'll move on to the second step for that thing. We're going to do something called yeast washing. So before you can just go reusing your yeast and just dumping it into the next beer, it's totally fine if you want to do that. If you've got another brew day, for example, lined up the same day that you took this yeast out or something, you can just go ahead and dump it straight in and it'll start fermenting. But there's two reasons you want to do yeast washing. Number one is because we've got a bunch of liquid here that's already got its own flavors. You know, a chocolate stout is a pretty strong flavor, and if we wanted to reuse this yeast for a pale ale, all of these flavors and aromas, they're going to influence the pale ale, so it's going to change that beer. Two, there's going to be a lot of trub in this. So there's going to be plenty of healthy yeast, but there's going to be a lot of just random gunk and matter that we don't really want going into the next batch either. So yeast washing is basically where you get some kind of vessel to store your yeast in. So for example, we're using laboratory grade equipment. You don't need it, you can just use mason jars or whatever. You put your yeast, your slurry, into your jar about halfway. Then the other half the way you fill it up with with water. So preferably deionized water, or double distilled water, something like that. But if you've got just great clean tap water, that'll do just fine for these purposes. So we're going to fill this up halfway with the slurry. We're going to fill up the other half with water. We're going to give it a little bit of a gentle mix so it all gets stirred around. Then we're going to pop this in the fridge. Leave it in the fridge for about a day until all of the sediment settles down, and then you're going to pour off that top layer of liquid, and then the middle layer is going to be the healthy yeast and the bottom layer is going to be trub. We'll get a shot of that when it happens, and then you can move on to the next step. So let's open this up. We want to do this part pretty quickly because this is a sterile environment and we want to keep it that way so that it's basically just the yeast and not all other bacteria and stuff growing inside here. So let's open this up. Give it a little stir. Fill this, where's the measuring? There it is. Fill this up to about halfway. Tell me when I'm at halfway. 500 mils. Yep.
Over a bit.
All right. Now fill it up with some water. And you do want to leave a little bit of headspace at the top just for gases and everything to have a bit of room to breathe. About there should be good. All right. Now we close this up and give it a little bit of a stir. Now we're going to pop this in the fridge. So what's going to happen with this, and we will take a shot in the the coming days, there's going to be a top layer that's going to end up being pretty clear, pretty clear liquid. That's just mostly water and the remaining sugars and all that kind of stuff. There's going to be a thin middle layer where it's like kind of a white paste looking thing, and that's the healthy, viable yeast. Then underneath that, there's going to be a bigger layer that's kind of gunky and brown and dark and dead looking. That's all the trub and the dead yeast. So we want to separate that middle layer from the rest of the stuff. So after this has been in the fridge for about a day or so, you carefully tip in one movement all that top layer out. When you get to that middle layer, you move it into a new clean sanitary jar, and then the rest of the trub you just chuck out. Now with that new stuff, you're going to fill it up again with water, give it a mix, let it sit there, and then you should have a pretty clean culture of yeast that's ready to use for your next batch. You can repeat this process a couple times if you want to keep purifying it, but just note that every time you do this, you're opening it up, you're exposing it to the environment, so there's every chance that it could get infected. So always good practice to use gloves, which I should have been doing, and to do it inside, to use clean and sanitary jars, all that kind of stuff. We've got a couple different scenarios that we're going to go through with our yeast cultures here. So this is the one that we're going to culture and actually grow later on because we need this for our next brew day. So may as well hit two birds with one stone while we make this video. Now, this is all the same strain here, just at different levels of having been washed, different levels of purity, I guess you could say. So this one here is basically straight out of the tank from that cut that we just came over from. So this is what you could call, I guess, the dirtiest yeast at the moment. These two have gone through one wash This one here has been washed a couple times. So if you look at the color difference, like I guess the clarity difference between these layers of gunk here and then this one over here, you can see how much more pure this yeast culture is here than this stuff that we've only washed one time. We're going to go through a couple of different things. We're going to actually culture this yeast strain here, so we want to grow more of this specific yeast. These two, this one here, we're going to do the first wash, so we're going to show you how to do that. And then these two here, we're going to do the second wash, so we'll show you how to do that. And then if you do this, these washing steps a couple times, you're going to end up with something like this. So really clear liquid on top and a really, really, packed sediment at the bottom, like nice and white, like kind of looks like sand on a really nice beach. That's really good, healthy yeast. Right, so the reason that we're boiling a big pot of hot water here is not because we're making dinner. It's because we need to sterilize all the equipment that we're going to be using. So, like all the jars specifically, you got to throw them into the pot. This is a thing called autoclaving. Autoclaving basically means you're going to sterilize something with heat. So you can autoclave with steam, with flames, or with really, really hot water. So the idea here is, these jars that we're using, we need to sterilize these things to make sure that there's nothing else living inside this. There's no bacteria, there's no fungi, no anything. We want this to be completely sterile before we go putting our yeast cultures into it. So we're gonna open these jars up and we're gonna whack them into the pot here, which is why you have tongs, so you can actually get these things out. So let's do that now. I think we're gonna sterilize 2 jars today. So obviously you can just use, do this in your kitchen if you want, whatever, it doesn't really matter. Just make sure you're working in as sterile an environment as possible and, don't burn yourself. Go under. Now you don't need to fully, submerge this thing underwater. Better if you can, but honestly, just being in this environment, as long as you get some water in it, even if it's not fully submerged, like for example, if we wanted to sterilize this and we couldn't get it all the way under and we just left it halfway in, just being in that level of heat is really what you're after. Let's put that one out because we're not using that one today, and we'll do this jar as well. Alright, so you don't need to cook the absolute crap out of this stuff, doesn't need to be in there forever, but if you can, leave it for 5 minutes. 5 minutes under 100 degrees boiling water, more than enough to kill anything that you're going to be working with at home. Obviously, if you're in a laboratory, different story, but for our purposes today, 5 minutes, boiling water, you're good. Quick note, using disposable gloves, that's an open flame. These things are not good with flame, and if they melt, they'll stick to your skin and you go into the emergency room. So make sure you turn the flame off before you put these on and you start working around heat. Just cautionary tale there. All right, so now we want to mask up, we want to glove up before we start taking these jars out, because from this point onwards, we want these jars to remain sterile. So the whole idea here is that we want to get these jars out and put the lids on them as quickly as possible without, the atmosphere getting into them. So let's do that now.
Some ASMR.
Worst ASMR ever. All right.
Cool.
Now we want to do the first wash of our yeast slurry. So it's a yeast slurry when it's come out of the fermenter tank into this, into the jar, into the mason jar, whatever you're collecting with. That's called a yeast slurry. We want to do the first wash to make our, our more purified yeast culture. We're going to need our jar, our mason jar, our reagent jar, whatever it is that you're using. You're going to need the clean, sterilized one. You're going to need that first slurry yeast culture right here. And then a jug or a sink or something to tip, gunk out into. Now, the key with this process is that we want to do it in the pour all in one fluid motion. So what we're going to do is we're going to tip this into this jar, but this whole top layer of liquid we're going to tip out. Then this middle, top layer here, which is where the actual healthy yeast is, we want to go in this jar. And then the bottom layer of crap, we want to, again, leave out of this jar. So we're trying to isolate that yeast layer to actually, get a pure culture of yeast going. Okay, so gloves on again, mask on, all that kind of stuff. Now we want to do this all in one hit. I'm going to open this up now. Make sure these glasses have cooled down by the time you're pouring the yeast into it, or you're going to kill the yeast. try to do it this way for the camera. That top layer of stuff that comes out is the stuff we want to keep. And there it is. Up until about there. When you start seeing the clumpier, dirtier stuff, that's when you want to stop pouring. So when it's still looking kind of silky smooth, whiter, paler, that's the yeast. That's what you want to get into here. Once you start getting to that more clumpy, dirtier looking, gunky stuff at the bottom of the jar when you're pouring it, that's when you want to cut the pour off and, you know, leave that stuff to the side. You don't want this in the culture anymore. Now from here, we want to tip this jar back up with clean water. So ideally, you would be using like triple distilled water, something like that. Really, really clean, pure water. If you don't have access to something like that, you know, tap water is fine. Just make sure whatever you're using is clean water, or at least as clean as possible. So when I open this up, tip this up to full now. Leave a little bit of head space at the top in case there's a bit of gas going on. And then, you know, just give it a gentle shake. So now this stuff is going to go into the fridge. You're going to leave it overnight or for a couple nights, depends on, you know, on how busy you are. Make sure you label the jar so you know what it is. So label it with what type of yeast culture it is, label what generation it is. So if this is the third time that you've used this yeast in making a beer, you'd call that Gen 3, G3, something like that. And label the date that you did this and how many times it's been washed. So this is the first wash now, so that will be wash number 1. Label it with all that info because you will forget later if you've got a whole bunch of different yeasts going on. But now you've got to pop this into the fridge and come back to it in a couple days. All right, now we're going to do our second wash on these cultures here. So these are both the exact same culture, you know, SO4, Safale English yeast. We're going to do a wash on both of these now. These have both been washed once already. So we want to wash it a second time to get it as close as possible to something like this. You wash it enough times, that's what you end up with. So if you come and bring the camera a little bit closer over here, it is hard to see the layers because these jars have been a little bit shaken up, but there's a whiter layer and then there's a bottom really gunky brown layer. That whiter layer is the thing that we want to go into our new jar. So again, mask on, get your sterilized jar that you're going to be using for this step, and away we go. So again, all that top layer of liquid, we're going to pour into the thing that we're going to dispose of. And we want to do this all in one fluid motion. So open that up, open this up. All right, now, so I'll try and make some room so you can see this. Here we go. All right, so you'll see that the white stuff is starting to come out of the jar about now. That is the stuff that we want to keep. That's our healthy yeast. And there's the gunk. All right, that's jar number 1 done. We'll just stop at that for a second. Let's do jar number 2. You want to try and minimize shaking any of this stuff up as much as possible. We've already shaken these things up around a little bit doing the filming, so that's a bit annoying, but if you can keep them as still as possible, you keep those yeast cakes as intact as possible and it's easier to transfer them. So once again, here we go. Transferring out this top layer. And we're getting close to that yeast coming out about now. Oopsies. And stop there. All right. From here, again, top it up with clean sterilized water. Alrighty, there we go. So now that is wash number 2. So you can do this as many, you can do this as many times as you want. The more times you do it, the more you're going to get to this quality of yeast. The issue is the more times you do it, there's also the chance you're going to introduce other bacteria or other pathogens in the atmosphere into your culture. So just be careful when you're doing it. Take all the precautions. But yeah, you know, the more times you do it, the more pure culture you're going to get. Now, once again, make sure you label everything so you don't forget what you've done. So this one would be SO4. I'd put the date down. I'd put what generation this is. So this is a generation 2 yeast. And then I'm going to do wash 2 because it's been washed 2 times now.